If China and the United States went toe-to-toe, is there a clear consensus as to who would win that?
Well, I think it's greatly contested. If China goes 100% full tilt invasion of Taiwan, we do not have enough assets in the region to stop them. I think the Russians look at Ukraine as the first step in a strategic war against the United States. The war really needs to be stopped. Otherwise, we try really hard at Forward Observer not to be like alarmists and hair on fire, but Max and I are both very concerned that the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine to stop a Ukrainian offensive, that could become the first of several, first of many. There are a lot of people in institutions, they look at the extreme left and they say, yeah, that's not a great look, but they're useful.
You don't come at this from one side is good, the other side is bad, right? Similar to how we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, you're like, look, this shit's messy.
We are locked in a spiral right now. And so really the next 2 years, I think, are going to be very difficult.
All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Mike here with me. I'm very excited about this because you operate in a world that I think most people don't understand, but is incredibly important. But it's all based on your background. You were in Intel, in the military. You spent some time as a contractor. Walk us through kind of what were you doing in the military, and then we can talk about how you're now using this in the civilian world to keep people informed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I enlisted in 2004. I was a 96 Bravo Intel analyst. And, you know, the military career, I didn't really like it, I guess, but I loved being on deployments. You know, you do your job, like you wake up, you have a mission, you have stuff to do. You know, we always say intelligence drives the fight. And I'm not trying to, play this up, right? I mean, most of the time I was sitting at a computer, but people have to make decisions. You know, commanders, and teams, they have to go to X place. They have to know what to expect once they get there. And somebody has to provide them with that intelligence. And so it really is a critical part of warfighting. Mm. And so, I really did enjoy the intelligence side. You get to, experience things that not many other people do. You get to watch, things on TV and say, oh, that's not right. Mm-hmm. That's the U.S. spin on what actually happened, And so I tell you, I fell in love with the job, and then I got into contracting. After that, I did 2 deployments. Went to Afghanistan in 06, 07, Iraq 08, 09, and then as a contractor went back to Afghanistan for 2010 and 2011. And I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed that as a career.
One of the things as you're talking that immediately goes back to is like you wake up every day, shave your face, put on the same uniform, you know where to go, you know where to be, you don't got to make very many decisions, and like life's pretty easy. And
that's right. Yeah.
People who've never experienced it, they're like, that sounds fucking crazy. These two guys are idiots, right?
Yeah.
But like there is this clarity that comes from being in an environment where you don't really think for yourself sometimes, right? Now, out on the battlefield or whatever, or in your case, a lot of times you're writing reports, like you're having to synthesize information, but there is something different about that experience that I think it's hard for people to understand until they go and do it. When you were doing the intel work, talk a little bit about the training that you get before you actually go out and get deployed and things like that. Because I think most people are like, oh, intel, like, is that like, Jack Bauer? Is that like some kind of field agent who's, hanging people up and like doing all kinds of crazy stuff? What is the training like? And then what does it actually mean, kind of day to day when you're out in a deployment?
Yeah. Big Army stuff, Big Army intel is like Big Army anything, but there is a part of the Army that, it's not James Bond, but, it gets a little bit into the gray zone or, gray area. But yeah, the train up, on the Big Army side, it is, you do your train up. It's like you zero your rifle, you go to the range, you get, you qualify with a M249 or, whatever you do, rollover training. It's probably a lot like just for everyone who's getting ready to deploy. And then, but on the intel side, there is, how well do you know the area? As soon as possible, figure out where you're going, what unit you're placing, get in touch with them, start getting a lay of the land, because it's very important, especially as an analyst, you have to understand the baseline of where you're going so that you can determine what is off baseline. Mm-hmm. And so having a head start on where you're going, learning the local tribes, the local power players, the Taliban, Naqshbandi, whatever groups are active in the area. Mm-hmm. During that train up, the more you know about those groups and what they've been doing, the better off you'll be, because once the unit you're replacing rips out, like there goes 11 or 12 months worth of knowledge, and it just literally disappears. And so, and then all of a sudden it's a commander asking you've been there for 30 days, expecting an answer like you've been there for 12 months.
One of, from my experience, something that someone said to me early on was they said the first 2 weeks and the last 2 weeks, those are the most dangerous ones. And I was like, why? And they were like, look, man, you think that these people aren't paying attention. You think these people aren't actively thinking all day long, how do we kill these motherfuckers, right? But like they are sitting there all day long and that's all they're thinking about. And when they see that truck drive by, they're like, I never seen that truck with that number on it before. It's a new unit. These dudes don't know what they're doing yet. They don't know where they are. They don't know who we are. Like, and it sure enough, like the intensity of attacks in the beginning and the end seemed kind of crazy. And you never really know why, right? Some of it's the changeover stuff. Some of it's maybe you're just on your game, kind of in the middle of the deployment. But I remember also the entire intel that we would receive, there was a change in quality, right around when you would do kind of left seat, right seat stuff. And it's just fascinating now in hindsight, kind of a little bit older, you get more context. You start to understand why this stuff happens. But like that happened how many times when units were changing out, throughout a 20-year war in two different countries, like thousands of times, right? And so literally somebody having to get up to speed on a brand new area in a matter of days, if not weeks, just happened over and over and over again.
Yeah, and Intel is just like any other MOS. Like they're the guys. These guys are going to excel. These guys fairly average. These guys should probably be like refueling trucks, or whatever. And nothing against the fuel guys, because that's all very important too. No,
we can give them shit.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, it's just like you stick an 11 Bravo in the arms room,
of course,
because he doesn't need to be out with everyone else. So in Intel, it's the exact same thing. You have the same challenges as everybody else. Just typically nobody's shooting at you.
So you talked about like establish a baseline and then recognize when something's off baseline. I'm assuming that this is both in the military and the contracting work, and then what you're doing today, kind of in the civilian world and keeping people informed on various threats and kind of regions of the world. How do you tell something's off baseline? Like maybe just when you look at a situation, how do you establish a baseline, and then how do you know, oh, that's an outlier. That's something that I should pay more attention to.
Well, the first thing is you have to establish a subject matter expertise on your topic. So, I'm knowledgeable about China, and I can sit here and talk a lot about China and Taiwan, but I'm not an expert in the Chinese military. I'm not a PLA guy. And so what you often kind of see on social media, especially it's the Dunning-Kruger, right? You read the Wikipedia page, and here's my 26 tweet thread on the Chinese PLA. So the first thing in establishing a baseline is you just have to have vast amounts of knowledge and information about what's going on. If you can, there's a couple of ways you can do this. Number one, you can use an indicator system where we see the PLA moving tanks around. Okay, well that's happened every day for the past 6 months. Okay, that's very in baseline, and then all of a sudden there's double the number of tanks, or in addition to tanks, now it's command and control vehicles, or it's air defense, or something that, well, we didn't see that last week, and now we're seeing it now. So identifying those indicators is kind of the first step there, and and then beyond that, the knowledge that you accrue just reading through the news every day. I guess it's kind of the same thing. You say, these politicians or these Chinese officials weren't talking like this last month. Now they are. And what's caused that change? Yeah.
I know you're not an expert on China, but I think everyone who hears China now wants to know, are they going to take Taiwan? When? Why? How? How do you all just kind of wrap your heads around a geopolitical situation that not only is rooted in the current day in kind of what I would consider more military warfare and strategy and things like that. There's also a commercial kind of threat standpoint, obviously with the chips and kind of Taiwan being so important to kind of the global infrastructure in that regard. But there's also a historical component to this. How did Taiwan get to the point where it is today, and what is kind of the expectation over time? Like, how do you all break down a situation like that?
Well, first, subject matter expertise, and you look at, as an analyst, you never want to say, well, China's going to do X, and they're going to do it on X day. Being an analyst on something like this is one reason why it's very difficult, is because they may not have decided exactly what they're going to do yet. And so you're being asked, hey, what is China going to do? How are they going to do this? And if they haven't decided, well, it's an impossible task.
Yeah.
However, you look at what China has said in the past, and China said, well, we don't want to fight a war. I think that's true. I don't think they want to fight a conventional war, because it's not just going to be against the United States. It's going to be against Australia or Japan, and other countries are probably going to get involved at that point. And really, at that point, we're looking at World War III anyway. They want to avoid that unless they're maybe 100% sure that they can win. I don't think they're there. So we have this thing called the gray zone, and it exists below the threshold of conventional war. And so, this is like using, China's doing this a lot with their maritime militia. They have a bunch of fishing boats that are armed, and they act as like a quasi, they call it the maritime militia, quasi Chinese PLA Navy, but they're just out there trawling, trying to catch fish. And so, Matt, our China analyst Max has talked about this quite a bit. We really think China does well in the gray zone, right? They really excel in the gray zone. Mm-hmm. So probably the most likely course of action at this point, it doesn't mean it's 100%, but most likely course of action is stay in the gray zone. Why risk fighting a conventional war when you can just surround Taiwan and embargo it, and you're not dropping bombs on Taiwan? You're not threatening to nuke Taipei, but you're also being highly coercive. You have not triggered war yet.
And so if there's some sort of embargo, blockade, whatever kind of the various tactics are, the idea would be that you almost have implicit control. You are driving the situation, you're coercing kind of what plays out, but you yet haven't stepped over the line to a point where the United States or other countries may say, hey, that's an act of war, and now we're going to come toe to toe with you. And so by doing that, that's kind of this gray zone you're talking about, where you have immense impact on the situation, but you're very careful as to where the line is. You never kind of step over. Is that like a fair way to kind of think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like using, like, let's just look at maybe a domestic scenario, right? Okay, I shoot you with the paintball, right? Is that going to cause you to use your firearm against me? Maybe not. That's a legal gray area. You're probably going to prison. That's kind of a gray zone tactic. It's where you are still taking steps to achieve your will. You're disrupting the enemy. You're deterring, their vast military might in terms of the United States, just the massive amount of firepower that could be over there. You're still carrying out your objectives. You're just not triggering war. You're not causing the other guy to pull the trigger yet. If
China and the United States went toe-to-toe, I understand, and I actually agree with you that it's unlikely that either country wants that. Now, whether it happens, we'll see. But if we got to that point, is there a clear consensus, whether it's in the intel community or just kind of in private conversations, as to who would win that?
Well, I think it's greatly contested.
Okay.
So a lot of it depends on one thing our China analyst Max talks about is the tyranny of distance. We do not have enough assets in there. If China goes 100% full tilt, high intensity conventional war, invasion of Taiwan, we do not have enough assets in the region to stop them. Mm-hmm. And so this is a case where China, over the course of several days, can start an amphibious assault against Taiwan. So it's going to be very difficult for the United States to win that war, just because it's going to take us so long to get over there.
How long? Is this like a 2-week period, or is this like 3 months?
Like easy 4 to 6 weeks to get. Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of carrier strike groups in the region, mm-hmm. And I'm not a Navy guy, but I'd expect easy 4 to 6 weeks to start putting stuff over there. We've been doing a lot of pre-position stock programs over there. We rebase some bombers to Australia. We're striking up some deal with the Philippines. I imagine we're going to start storing munitions over there. But I forgot who said this, but I think it was some Air Force general over there in Indo-Pacific Command. He said they have something like 10 days worth of munitions in a full-on fight against China. They have 10 days worth of munitions. So we better win it in 10 days. That's why I have very significant doubt that we can actually win that war, mm-hmm. short of full-scale mobilization, put everybody in theater, and throw everything you have at the Chinese.
What I find intellectually interesting about kind of the war gaming of this, the kind of hypothetical situations, and people have heard me talk about this before, but like it's not to minimize the obvious loss of life and kind of all the seriousness of war. But this is not an exercise of where the United States has been highly successful recently. This is not, hey, call SEAL Team 6 and let's send a couple guys over and like do their thing and they come back, we talk about them on national television like we win, right? This is very much if there is a direct combat type engagement, the United States is going to have to bring jets, bombs, strikers, I mean, just everything we got. And we haven't fought a war like that in a long time. And what I think ends up being interesting is it's also not on land. Right now, yes. Could we get it to land? Could we kind of go play that game? Of course. But what we're talking about here, you're talking about, a maritime militia. We're talking about Navy. We're talking about all these different things that add a degree of complexity, which it is unclear to me as a civilian who doesn't spend all day thinking about this stuff and reading it. How good are we? Right in that environment. So how do you think about, like, forget what China would do, just like the United States readiness and its ability to, if it had everything in place, just fight in the sea against, any enemy?
So the first thing I think about a war over there is logistics. We got to get troops over there. We got to get equipment. We got to get spare parts, food, water, ammo, all that stuff. China does not have a highly capable blue water navy. They're trying to, they're in the process of developing that. So, the first thing is how difficult will it be for us to have like an Iraq style logistics train, but to the Indo-Pacific? Now, some of that stuff will be coming from our allies in the region. We got to go back to like 10 days worth of munitions. How many weeks is it going to take for us to get more stuff over there? And, the thing is, it's not just getting more stuff over there. We've been supplying Ukraine with so many munitions now. And I can't confirm that this is true, but, I'm sure people have seen it around. Like, we have Army units right now and Marine units saying, hey, we're running out of HIMARS. We don't even have HIMARS to train the new guys who are just getting to their first station. And so, I really do question, this is probably going to take like years for us to replenish all the munitions that we've already sent to Ukraine. So that's the second thing I think about.
I do wonder, again, it's very easy to talk about Russia-Ukraine as a conflict and a contained conflict in the sense of it, two countries are going at it. And the United States obviously has a vested interest in trying to participate. There's plenty of people who think that we shouldn't be participating in any form or fashion, but we're at least sending aid at the moment. There was confirmation recently that there are troops on the ground. What they're doing, highly controversial, debatable, the whole thing. But it sounds like so far there has been no confirmation that U.S. troops are actually engaged in direct combat on the ground with, Russian troops or whatever. With that said, it's very easy to talk about China and Taiwan and the direct conflict there in a self-contained kind of environment. But what you're really highlighting is like, no, man, this is a global game, right? And, imagine the world where Russia and Ukraine is just the warm-up to China, Taiwan. And to your point, we've depleted resources. We've depleted the will of the American citizens, of our politicians, of military leadership to engage now in a dual front, battle where on the outside of either one of those, you would say, hey, this is really important. And you put them both together, it's like, shit, this gets kind of crazy. And so do you think that this is top of mind for people right now, like the political leaders, the folks who kind of read the intel that you guys put out on a daily basis? Or is this something that you all are sitting there looking at it more from like a military strategy standpoint? You're like, yeah, I'm sure the military leaders are thinking about it, but everyone else pretty much is, not even aware or thinking that this is an important kind of component to consider.
Well, from the Eastern perspective, the Russian and Chinese perspective, I think the Russians look at Ukraine as the first step in a strategic war against the United States. China looks at Taiwan probably as, if they lose, then this may be the end of the quote unquote Chinese century. But for the Chinese, they look at this and they say, this is a stepping stone to replacing U.S. global hegemony. And they're right now doing this economically and trying to do it financially. I don't think they want to do it militarily, but they're one way or the other, they're going to take Taiwan or they're going to lose 1 billion people trying to do it. So from the Eastern perspective, yeah, this is about the next century. This is which sphere is going to own, kind of have global dominance. For the United States, you read the latest national security strategy and latest national defense strategy, and they're well aware. I mean, they outline it. They say this decade is going to be decisive. It is going to determine what happens this decade is going to determine the new rules-based international order. I think they're acutely aware of it. I think they're way behind the curve, though.
When you think about the military conflict, it's easy to say, hey, I get it, cool. We don't line up, soldiers in a line in a field anymore and kind of fire. But the direct combat, I think people can wrap their heads around. You mentioned financial and economic war and kind of, again, this ability to drastically kind of influence the direction of things without actually stepping over that line. What do you all pay the most attention to or are most worried about in terms of the other types of, maybe in the most easy way to describe it, competition, in the most kind of direct and abrasive way, the actual conflict that is happening, that isn't military but is more economic.
Yeah, I think competition is a diplomatic term. I think the United States and China and the East in general, I think they are going to be locked into kind of in an economic and financial death match. When Biden signed the CHIPS Act and we undercut Chinese chips production, I mean, that's escalatory. That's very significant. And we're still looking at how is China going to retaliate. I don't think, Chinese President Xi Jinping came out some time ago and apparently wrote a letter to some Chinese interest groups in the United States saying, we don't want a confrontation, we don't want to escalate. And that's what they say. But, back in Beijing, that's not at all what they're doing. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has even come out on numerous times this year and said, Asia's time in global governance has come. Like, we are going to replace the United States. We're going to topple the unipolar world. We're going to cement China as a driver of and as a matter of fact, they have this thing called the Global Development Initiative or the Global Security Initiative. We see China establishing BRICS and the BRICS Plus, which is fairly new. Argentina, Saudi Arabia, several other countries. Actually, I think we're up to 19 countries now that have said that they plan to apply or are very interested in joining BRICS Plus. And so economically, or I guess I should say monetarily, China does not want to, I don't think they want to replace the US dollar as the world reserve. I don't think.
Why not?
Because their capital markets and credit markets are not large enough to do it. No one in Brazil wants to accept the yuan right now or renminbi. But what they can do is use BRICS and BRICS Plus to undermine the US dollar for probably 20 to 40% of global trade. And I think the Chinese would be very happy to do that, because if Brazil and India are no longer using the dollar as the standard of trade, then that greatly diminishes U.S. power and influence abroad. And so, I think China's not in a position to do that. And undermining the dollar is gray zone warfare. I mean, it is monetary and economic warfare. They're going to potentially cause a massive monetary crisis if they do start going down this road, and more countries start saying, yeah, we're not going to use the dollar. We'll do bilateral currency trade. We'll just, if we have a trade, if our trade is even, then we're just swapping each other's currencies. And as long as those currencies remain stable, we don't have to use the dollar. Well, that's a lot of international demand just disappearing. That's exactly what the Chinese want.
When you talk about currencies, obviously everybody who watches this says, "Oh, Bitcoin's the solution," right?
Yeah.
And I'll kind of give some context here. One of the ideas that I've had, which I don't necessarily think is right or see a clear path as to why it's wrong, but I think is interesting. I've always thought that the single best place to be is to be the owner of the global reserve currency, right? As we've seen for centuries now. But if you are not the owner of the global reserve currency, the second best place to be is to be using a currency along with everyone else that no one controls, right? And so kind of this idea of, okay, I want the global reserve currency. If I can't have it, then no one should have it. And then we should go use something that's decentralized or whatever. I like Bitcoin, right? I got a ton of bias when it comes to that. Right. That story sounds awesome. Yeah. How do you see Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, stablecoins, like all these different technologies that are kind of related in some form or fashion and kind of coming from one industry, playing into these geopolitical games, especially like economic and monetary warfare, where, okay, if we can take away US dollar demand, like that helps us push forward this kind of 100-year plan that we have.
Mm-hmm. I do watch the Federal Reserve with great interest where it concerns central bank digital currencies. I know it's every week their Fed bank presidents are coming out saying, hey, we have to have more regulation. We got to have congressional action. I think they understand that stable coins are going to play a much larger role in the U.S. and international economies. And this is not an area where they can lose control. I mean, if you're the Fed, you cannot lose a monopoly over the U.S. dollar or the use of dollar-denominated trade. I don't know. I know there's a lot of stable, like very serious stable currencies, and the people developing those are developing stable coins. Developing those to replace the U.S. dollar. And I'll tell you, I'm just not sure how the Fed is going to be able to co-opt that. I'm not an FX guy. I'm not a big monetary academic, but I do wonder if those stable coins are backed 1-to-1 to the dollar. Maybe that alone is good for the Fed because it just creates additional demand, even though China is trying to actively sap demand for the dollar in international trade.
Yeah, it's something I've paid attention to for 5 years now. I can remember 2018, 2019, literally going on national television talking about this idea of, hey, if the United States wants to remain the leader and have the global reserve currency, there are a ton of risks and a ton of reasons why I actually don't think central bank digital currencies are good. One of the pro arguments would be that it's all about accessibility. And so if you're in Venezuela and your local currency fails and you say, well, shit, that's not good. So I want dollars. I can't get dollars because it's dangerous. It's difficult. It costs a lot. Whatever the reason is. And if I try to flee something that's physical, like gold or whatever, that's also dangerous. Let me get on the internet. What can I use there? It's actually not, in many cases, Bitcoin, right? It's volatile. They don't understand it. There's all these things. If they can get access to a digital dollar, to your point, it's backed 1-to-1 to the dollar. That's damn well just as good as having a dollar, right? In that scenario. Sure, right. But if there is no digital dollar that's super popular, especially one that is backed by and kind of put into the market by the Federal Reserve, but there so happens to be a Chinese currency, well, shit, I may become a fan of that because it provides me stability and the ability to use it in a digital environment and kind of all these things. And so I've always thought that the digital currencies, especially the central bank digital currencies, there's, who's faster, who, is cheaper to use, all that stuff. But there's just a pure accessibility play and kind of competition because ultimately there are people around the world where their currency fails them and they're looking for an alternative. And some of them will turn to Bitcoin and, decentralized or private currencies or whatever. Some of them are going to turn to central bank digital currencies and kind of whoever has got the most, or the furthest so far, whoever's got the most accessibility has a significant advantage in my opinion.
I look at this as another avenue for gray zone warfare. I think probably the Fed right now is intentionally trying to crush all other competitor currencies, like the yuan, renminbi, and
they've been pretty damn successful at that.
Well, they have been. They absolutely have been. And so, if you're China, you obviously do not like this. I am quite concerned about how China is going to retaliate. China, they're not doing well. I mean, they're really kind of on the ropes economically. This thing like, oh, we're going to be happy with 5%, GDP growth. Okay, whatever you have to tell Financial Times, but they've had massive investor outflows, a lot of money leaving that country, a lot of concern about how about Western sanctions, how if China's going to get the Russia treatment over Taiwan, and so I don't know how successful China is actually going to be when they're making. China's in a position where they have to grow the BRICS plus. Because a lot of these other countries are going to start turning on Chinese commerce. And the more the world bifurcates, and Peter Zion talks about deglobalization, that's a real threat to China. And so I look at that and I think what's going to end up happening is, we're going to go right back. Probably already are right back into the Cold War. And these spheres are probably going to be attacking each other's currencies just because they can get away with it and know that's not going to trigger World War III. Yeah.
Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, has been quite lucid in his commentary about the U.S. economy, about the U.S. addiction to social media and printing money. I mean, just there's line after line after line in many of his recent speeches where you listen to it and you say, listen, I get it. People are super pissed, and rightfully so, that he invaded Ukraine and kind of all these things that they're quite upset about. But if you can separate out the man from the comments seem like something that we should be paying attention to. And it fits very similarly in line with, I think, what you're talking about from China's perspective. obviously, I don't see a lot of people lining up to go get the ruble, right?
Right.
And there hadn't been nearly as much investment in that country as there had been in China, and kind of they're coming at it from a different perspective. But he talks about a multipolar world, and that's like the phrase he continuously uses over and over and over again. Is that ultimately the goal? It's not actually even to crush the United States, have the United States suffer in some, immense way. It's like, hey, look, if we can just pull ourselves up to be equivalent to the United States, they've got kind of one, side of the world, we got the other side, and that alone would be victory. Is that kind of the way you look at it, or is that maybe being too innocent and naive in terms of their intentions and what they also might think is possible?
It's probably a first step. But there are other steps. I really do. I think Putin wants to see the United States suffer. He looks at the collapse of the Soviet Union as a humiliating event. And, this is something he says in his speeches. He gave a speech last month and he said, the real travesty of the last century is that when the Soviet Union fell, there was no counterweight. There was no counterbalance to world power. And he has to provide that balance. I think Ukraine is a first step towards that. We see Russia and China expanding and deepening their alliance. That is part of that. I don't think China's going to be happy with just a multipolar world. They're resource starved. They've got 1 billion people. They need components and materials. They really don't. There's virtually no domestic. There's some oil, but not a lot. They're a net importer of food and fuel, and so I don't think this is simply. I don't think the United States is going to be happy with that outcome. And I don't think China or Russia are going to be happy with the outcome. So I think we're probably in a position where one side wins outright over the other. It's a Pyrrhic victory, and we just both destroy each other. Or maybe, I'd say maybe some third party that's relatively unscathed kind of becomes the next global superpower. So, but to answer the question, I don't see China being happy with that. Definitely not Russia.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine, how do you evaluate it? Obviously, it's been condemned by pretty much every country in the West for the most part. They don't buy the story of the denazification of Ukraine. They obviously believe there's a threat for nuclear war, and I think it's pretty well covered and kind of documented in terms of both the Western point of view of the action, the actual invasion itself, a little bit of a celebration in that they weren't necessarily able to overrun the country in maybe the way that the West would like to think that they thought they could do. Mm-hmm. And now you got kind of a Western force that continues to supply aid and weaponry and kind of all this stuff locked up, with the country of Russia. How do you look at it? Like what are the main takeaways for people? And then are there things that maybe that the West has been told or the media has covered that might not either be true or maybe we shouldn't put as much weight on it as they already have? Mm-hmm.
I think the West did overestimate Russian capabilities. A guy I went to college with is still in the Army, and he was telling me about how they're running all these drills to learn how to deal with Russian artillery on the battlefield. And at that time, this was a few years ago, Russian artillery outranged what we had. And so I do think there was, and a few other guys led me to believe that there was the expectation that the bear was back, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I think the Russians have probably underperformed their expectations in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. When Putin came out and fired a bunch of generals, that's a pretty sure sign that they were not doing well, or they're not doing meeting his standard. And I think that's probably the biggest indicator that Putin has been disappointed in Ukraine.
So you think that the United States, we overestimated what they were capable of doing, which I guess if you miss, that's probably the better direction to miss in. And at the same time that we're overestimating their capabilities, Russian forces are underperforming Putin's expectations and kind of desires. And so you get kind of this, I don't want to call it a stalemate because it feels like there's still pretty heavy direct fighting. But it does feel like it's now gone from defend Ukraine to there is war. And, I don't know the future, but it almost feels like, hey, if you woke up 10 years from now and they were still fighting each other, Iraq, Afghanistan, right? Kind of just, hey, they're just locked into this kind of drawn out war now that doesn't seem to have an end because they won't come to the table with each other. There's a lot of people who believe they shouldn't come to the table with each other. And so how do you kind of say, okay, where are we now? And where is this going?
Well, it's going nowhere good. And, you saw last month the the Democratic Progressive Democratic Caucus come out, and they accidentally sent that letter to Biden that said, "Hey, go talk to the Russians, stop the war." Yeah, the war has to be stopped. I think we are getting much closer to the nuclear threshold. And when Zelensky and the Ukrainians say, "Oh, we're going to go into Crimea, we're going to go and we're going to retake Donbass," that is right into that Russian doctrine says, "Hey, there's like three cases where we would use nuclear weapons, and a violation of Russian territorial integrity is one of them." And so this probably is the case where if the Ukrainians do pose a significant threat to Crimea, and then I mean China would be well within their doctrine to use nuclear weapons. So I think actually this is the case where like the war really needs to be stopped. Otherwise, we try really hard at Forward Observer not to be like alarmists and hair on fire, but Max and I are both very concerned that the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine to stop a Ukrainian offensive could well, I mean, that could become the first of many.
Okay, so there's a lot of people who, there's some details in here that I don't think that they're quite aware of. Crimea and Donbass, I think, is an interesting area. I'm not an expert. I don't know if you would consider yourself an expert or maybe
I've
educated.
seen it on the map.
Okay, all right, you've seen it on the map. Russia took it. And from their view, my understanding is they believe that that is Russian territory that was outside of the Russian borders, and now they took it back. It's theirs. Case closed, and they don't really want to talk about anything else other than that's ours. Mm-hmm. Ukraine feels like, hey, you invaded Crimea and Donbass, and you stole that from us, and we may not come back right away, but we are going to get our fucking country back, right? Mm-hmm. We are going to get our land back. Russia invades Ukraine, and the Ukrainians, part of the surprise, I think, to many people in the West, and frankly, even Ukrainians that I know, people in Eastern Europe, right, that I've talked to are like, damn. The Ukrainians have held their own, right? They've been able to put up a fight in a way that whether it's the Russians screwing up or the Ukrainians just, outperforming expectations, they have been able to hold the Russians off. But what you just described is not defensive. Now what the conversation has shifted to, and Zelensky has publicly said, I think on multiple occasions, is that the Ukrainians believe that once they basically push back the Russians, they then will go past what has been the quote-unquote border, and I put that in air quotes because it's debated, of Russia and Ukraine, and they are going to take back Crimea and Donbass. Now, there are a lot of people in this entire region who have been fighting each other for a long time, mm-hmm. right? And I don't think it's fair, and frankly, it'd be arrogant and ignorant, I think, for Americans to sit here and say, we know exactly who's what and where it is and who owns what and the whole thing. And there's a lot of shit that we will never understand, frankly, because I don't speak Russian, right? And so you just get through all the complexity, all the caveats. But your point is that if Ukraine does breach that line and say, hey, we are coming for Crimea, we are coming for Donbass, and we are going to take them, and the Russians believe that it is possible, that's where you think that the nuclear weapon could be used.
Yes. Well, it's not a prediction, but I will just say,
you think it's possible?
Russia would be well within their doctrine of use.
Okay.
Now, Crimea has been a part of Russia since the American Revolution, and you're absolutely right. We really do a disservice to this conflict by trying to view everything through American lenses. It is rarely the case where things are just as cut and dry as good guy and bad guy. Hey, you know what? What if they're both bad guys? I mean, let's just be honest here. Especially
to that point, war happens, and in war, there's a lot of nasty shit that happens.
Sure,
right
on both sides. Yeah,
and so from my view, to slap our moral frameworks onto this is to essentially raise our hands and say we don't understand war, right? To some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. War is more than just the application of violence, especially among the people involved. I mean, there's a lot of psychology and information operations, involved, the mental space. So, I think, Putin has talked about doing this. I mean, Donetsk way back in the, mid 2010s, Donetsk and Luhansk. There are ethnic Russians in that part of the country. And I'm not going to sit here and say that their elections and referendums were free and fair and they said, oh, yeah, hey, let's go join the Russian Federation. Undoubtedly, a lot of them want that exactly. But I think this is a case where Putin says, look, there are ethnic Russians there, and we are going to go back and reclaim territory from the Russian Federation that should have never been given to Ukraine, never given away. And so, that's where they are. I'm a realist, and I say, there's not a perfect world. You really cannot have your cake and eat it too. The best thing that could possibly happen, I think, for the world is for Crimea and the Donbass regions to be in the Russian Federation and in the war. Because otherwise, Zelensky wants this thing to go nuclear. He wants NATO to get involved. Zelensky will start World War III to save Ukraine. And I'm not in that position to support that.
So it's very interesting because Zelensky, I remember reading, I don't know, whenever he got elected a couple years ago, I believe Trump got elected and then Zelensky got elected shortly thereafter, a year or two, whatever. I just read a headline, comedian gets elected, right? And I was like, oh, got a TV star, right? Then we got a comedian, is this going to be a thing? And that was basically my only exposure whatsoever to Zelensky. And then when the war started, I saw him on television. I said, damn, that guy seems pretty inspirational. You could see how a country would rally around this individual, right? And a friend said to me, he goes, don't forget he's an actor. Right. And so, by the way, so are many politicians in the United States, whether they get paid for it or not. Right. They put on the face and then they go and then they're media trained. They've got great communication skills, all the things that you need to be a politician and be successful. And then it started to get kind of crazy, in my opinion, because you had the Russians doing things that you'd wake up every morning and you'd be like, that's crazy, right? And that's bad. And then you would hear language from American politicians, from Zelensky, and other people around the world. This isn't just, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. This is NATO, this is other countries, whatever. And you just started saying holy shit, does anybody actually want it to end, right? And I think your point about if Zelensky, and again, it's right? If Zelensky's strategy is to basically keep ratcheting this up until NATO steps in and says, we will protect you, we promise you, we have your back. I mean, it seems pretty clear that Russia would then say, fucking send the nukes, right? And at that point, if NATO's involved, that just doesn't seem like a good place. I don't know. I'm very confused in terms of how the war game plays out if we get to a point where Zelensky is super offensive and the Russians actually use a nuke, kind of what happens after that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the U.S. defense establishment, I think a lot of them do want to get more involved. I would bet dollars to donuts that NATO has troops in Ukraine. I mean, there are soft dudes out there, whacking Russians for sure.
There's some of them who don't even have uniforms on. I see them on Instagram, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Those are the unsanctioned ones. Yeah, you're talking about the sanctioned ones.
They're in Ukrainian uniforms. I should be more clear. But so, if you're Poland, if you're the Baltics, you probably don't want the war to end. You want to see it keep going, and Western sanctions try to bleed Russia dry. Putin came out, I think in September, maybe October, came out and said, yeah, the Russian economy we're going to have challenges. We have to actually pivot the economy away from oil and gas. And he said, we have to start developing new industries. And so, I think Putin understands this is going to be a long-term strategic battle. If you're Poland and the Baltics, you don't want to be next. I mean, if you're Lithuania and Estonia have ethnically Russian populations in the eastern parts of those countries, they don't want to be Donbass. Mm-hmm. I completely understand that. And so from NATO's perspective, you say, well, if you give Russia this cookie, they're going to try to take the whole cake. And, which I think there's probably some truth to the argument. So this is a very complex issue. It's not just hey, Russia bad, NATO good. Honestly, yeah, so I don't even think NATO's the good guy anymore. But
you don't think NATO's the good guy anymore?
NATO, all these NATO leaders, they're all globalists. And, you look at a lot of these European leaders, they're all WEF people, World Economic Forum, the superstars or the young WEFers or whatever they're called, Mm-hmm. And I'm an anti-globalist. I don't want to see that. And by supporting NATO, that's exactly what you're supporting now. And I try not to interject my personal beliefs into this, but I don't think NATO's the good guy anymore. Mm-hmm. I think NATO is defending and advancing globalism.
when they do that, I think their argument would be, and I always try to think kind of like, what's the pro and con argument, right? Their argument would be like, well, we were lured into it, right? We were, somebody else instigated, and we're just kind of finishing the fight. Do you think that has weight or kind of holds water, or do you think that that sounds good and as a soundbite, but may not be as obvious maybe when you actually do the analysis?
NATO exists as a defender of rules-based international order, and so NATO, they can say, we were. I don't think they could say like we're lured into supporting Ukraine, but you didn't ask this question, but I would just tack on. We've seen South Korea and Japan get involved in NATO. NATO, they've been sending officials to Japan and NATO working on military interoperability. This NATO summit in June, they came out and said, hey, we're going to start taking an increased focus in the Indo-Pacific theater because China is a direct threat now to NATO or something like that. China is a competitor or something like that. And this is global NATO. I just ask, if NATO's not going to stick to the North Atlantic and now they're going to shift into global NATO, like what's step 3? And I don't want to get close to step 3.
Yeah. The last thing I want to talk about Russia, Ukraine, nuclear weapons of any degree, I think scare the shit out of people, right? Some cases rightfully so, and some of it's just ignorance they don't understand. On kind of the first part of this, like tactically, do they just shoot one? Right? Do they? Is it like hey, let's cover the whole country? Like, how do you think? Do they actually go just after Crimea and the Donbass region? Like, I guess if you had to say like, okay, cool, we get to the point where they're like, yes, this is the line, you breached the line, we are going to use these weapons. What does that look like from a tactical standpoint?
Well, conventional deployment, yeah, they could put on a rocket, or or a plane drop a bomb or something like that. I think a very Russian thing to do. And by the way, the Ukrainians and Russians have been both accusing each other of getting ready to deploy a dirty bomb. And so a very Russian thing to do would be to deploy a dirty bomb and blame it on the Ukrainians.
Explain what a dirty bomb is.
Oh, just a radiological device where it's not actually a nuclear weapon, but it's an explosive with nuclear chemicals in there, and you get all the radiological elements dispersed. And it's not like a big atomic bomb, but like it kills people, and not only kills people. That area has to be uninhabited. You cannot live there anymore. And I think the strategy would be deploy one and say, all right, yeah, Ukraine, you want to keep talking, you want to keep coming into Crimea, telling us how you're going to come into Crimea. That's fine. We'll set another one off. So I would hope it's zero, but after that, I hope it's one and done. But this is how this is kind of it's very escalatory. But this may be how Russia tries to break Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. When that occurs, what do you think the response is? So like the tactical component of, sure, they could drop a bomb, a rocket, whatever. I think actually if I asked the average person on the street in America, they'd say that's how it's going to happen, right? Like they're going to shoot a rocket over and we've got some defense, or we're going to do something or whatever. I have no clue. But let's say that there is some escalatory kind of dirty bomb, nuclear weapon, whatever used by Russia. What is the reaction from NATO and the U.S.? Is that fuck it, game on, we're bringing all hell and fury with us, and like we're going to just take down Putin and Russia and just not even in the Donbass, Crimea region, but like now we're coming after the whole country? Or do you think it's more measured than that?
Mm-hmm. Maybe it depends on delivery. I said rocket, but they could put it on like a short range ballistic missile or something like that.
That's the same thing to the people in the street.
So the U.S., you have like General Petraeus come out and say, we're going to wipe the Russians out of Ukraine. We're going to hit every single Russian military facility in Ukraine if Russia does go nuclear. And I don't know if Petraeus is the talking head for the White House, or if or if that's more like his opinion and kind of bravado. I don't know that the U.S. military, frankly, other than maybe an aerial campaign. Honestly, I keep going back to the nuclear thing. If, they wanted to start this no-fly zone over Ukraine, which, by the way, I still think is potentially an option here. That may be one U.S. or potential course of action, is to establish a no-fly zone and say, well, if it's violated, then you're going to have to literally fight everybody now. So it probably depends on delivery and maybe where it is too. I mean, if it's in like some industrial facility, maybe, I mean, that's bad. It's not as bad as setting one off in downtown Kiev.
Yeah.
So maybe it depends. I don't have any insight into, what the 4 stars at the Pentagon are thinking, but my bet would be the worse the scenario, probably the greater the U.S. response would be.
Yeah. One of the things that fascinates me after having, been in a war zone is there's the war you see, and then there's the war that you don't see. And the war that you don't see, and I've talked about it before with other guests, in some ways almost crazier. Right. And people would expect it to be, okay, there's a lot of stuff that's happening, in the cover of dark or the tactics or whatever. But this specific scenario to me seems the perfect setup because you do have some pretty immense threats. The U.S. is, I guess on a technicality, not involved. But I'd be shocked if we weren't very well aware of as much as possible and in a position to step in if needed. And so if that is the case, my guess is that the Russians know that and the Ukrainians know that. And so does NATO. And you get into this almost like there's a kind of in front of the curtain, behind the curtain. And what's going on behind the curtain feels more like chess. And what's going on in front of the curtain feels more like checkers of just like,
right.
Hey, okay, I move here. What are you going to do? Right. And at the same time, people are behind the curtain and, they're waiting to see what everyone else on the chessboard does before they go ahead and they make their decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is bigger than Ukraine. I mean, for Putin, Ukraine's probably a first step. And for the United States, I think, honestly, I think they want to regime change Putin. And so if the United States, the West is successful in defeating the Russians in Ukraine and turning Crimea and Donbass back into kind of disputed territory like 2017, I think they'll go after Putin.
What does that look like?
And that's that's the chess. They tried to do it through sanctions, going after the oligarchs and getting the oligarchs to turn on Putin. It didn't work.
I'm actually shocked as to how little it seems to have impacted a whole bunch of things. But it's like, you see the sanctions, they're pissed, right? Obviously. They're trying to distance themselves. I mean, all the things you would expect from like an individual incentive mechanism. But unless you guys have some information or done some work that I'm unaware of, it doesn't seem like it really had that much of an impact within the country of Russia. Maybe there was some uprising, but nothing that really seems material.
I think when you're in a position where you lose your yacht or you lose your life, things get a lot simpler decision-wise. And so, you look at the individual oligarchs who were sanctioned and they lost a lot of money. I don't see how they can think like maybe they'll ever get that back. And so I don't know. We'd have to sit down and kind of, think this through. But there are undoubtedly ways in which the United States and the West could turn the heat up on Putin. As for how they regime change him, I don't know. I really honestly, let me say this. I'm not going to answer that right now. And not because I don't have inside information, but I tell you, I really want to give you like well thought out answers. Yeah. And I clearly have not thought this through, but there are ways. Yeah.
When we think about the United States fight abroad, what's fascinating to me, and I think I said on an interview or something, I said, we're sending billions of dollars to many other conflicts around the world, not just the Russia-Ukraine situation. But then you look and, Jackson, Mississippi, they don't have clean water, or Flint, Michigan, and some of these other things. Forget this exact moment in time, forget these exact conflicts, just from an intel perspective, how does the United States think about when to help abroad versus when to help domestically? And I know you guys have done a lot of work on some domestic stuff as well, but like, what does that framework look like? And does it change? And I think that's like a really key piece to this is like, does it change with administrations? Does it change with various threats? Or is there a pretty rigid, hey, these people are focused on domestic, these people are focused internationally?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are different organizations you're dealing with and different objectives. I don't even know the calculus on how the U.S. government decides to help domestically. But yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame that we see so much going to Ukraine while there are veterans who are still trying to get access to the VA, and there are still homeless Americans and kids who are not eating in this country. I'm not saying those things are necessarily the government's job. I'm just saying it's interesting where we send our money.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems in the world in general, but also there's a lot of problems here domestically as well. Some of the, I think when I first started coming across some of your work, 2020, you guys seem to become very popular in a lot of circles because you were tracking a lot of the domestic activities, political extremism, a lot of the everything from protests to riots to violence to threats. Kind of just it seemed like you were trying to build the board game, right? And you were trying to understand it. And I think what I and many other people appreciated who followed you on Twitter and stuff like this is it seemed like we are not on any one side. We are trying to understand what's happening here and almost have kind of taken a step to the sideline and we're watching the field, right? Mm-hmm. And so talk a little bit about kind of through 2020 into 2021, what you guys were seeing, kind of what was that like in terms of trying to actually get that information and ensure accuracy, I think to some degree in a time where there's just a lot of movement and kind of things changing on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. This goes back to 2016. And one of the reasons why I started Forward Observer is because there's a lot. I mean, there's just a lot of institutional money and a lot of focus on tracking far-right groups. And they really gloss over far-left groups. And I'm not talking about your, run-of-the-mill Bernie bros. There are a lot of actual revolutionaries out there. And so, even when you look at the quote-unquote anti-fascist movement, they won't be happy if Trump's gone, right? It'll be on to the next domino, on to the next thing. People who are not fascists, and I don't even think Trump was a fascist. And why is that? Because they're revolutionaries. They want to topple the capitalist system, and in many cases, they're also various flavors of anarchists, and they want to live in a state-free society. So hang on, if you're the U.S. government here, how are you not giving more more due diligence to these groups? Because you read the zines and the pamphlets and the flyers and stuff they pass out, and you read their blogs and see what they're posting on social media. They're not talking about, hey guys, let's go organize a protest. They do that too. They're sharing like Carlos Marighella and all these leftist insurgent literature and the manuals about how these communist insurgents and revolutionaries carried out their own revolutions abroad. And so this is not just like a run-of-the-mill protest group. So when we look at that, we go to direct sources. We go read what they say, watch the videos, do all those things.
When I hear you say that, what I take away from it is you got extremism on the right, you got extremism on the left, and maybe the common perspective or shared dream. The U.S. government does not look the way it is, does not have the power it has, all this stuff.
Sure, right.
Where they drastically diverge is what happens next. Kind of what does that world look like, whether it is kind of more right, leaning and kind of all the things that generally get assigned to that group versus a left-leaning world that is stateless or kind of less of the U.S. government. Is that fair that there is commonality of like destruction of the system, but really the divergence is maybe on the tactics in which to do it, but then also on like what the system looks like on the other side of that event? Mm-hmm.
Yes. There are some commonalities. I would say the biggest divergence especially in how the U.S. government looks at these groups is there are a lot of people in institutions, left-wing institutions in the United States, and I would include the U.S. government in there, as they look at the extreme left and they say, yeah, that's not a great look, but they're useful. Mm. And I think, near as I can tell, that's probably the number one reason why those far left groups don't get the same look as the far right groups. And, also too, the right in general is just much better armed. The U.S. government is not in a position where they can allow those groups to organize and coordinate.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that when you say they're useful, what does that mean?
I think ideologically they're useful. In 2016, trying to beat back on Trumpism, trying to beat back on it's always amazing the anti-fascist groups, Antifa. They never go after like the hardcore skinheads and big biker gangs who will like literally kill them. They go after the more milquetoast right wing groups out in the street. But who's the bigger fascist? Maybe the white supremacist or white nationalist skinhead biker gang or the kids out in the street.
So you think that it's almost like I don't know, biological, like human nature shit, where it's like who's the fucking alpha on the street when there's no police, there's no anything, and so like pick on what is perceived as the weaker group, and so that's where like the focus goes.
I don't think it's necessarily you look at those groups and they are much weaker compared to like a white nationalist biker gang, like the 1%er clubs or whatever. One of the things that these left-wing people chant is whose streets, our streets.
Whose streets, our streets. Okay.
Yeah, and so these groups see themselves as, well, we cannot allow them to proselytize, to talk about their issues and grievances. You can't allow them to hold a demonstration on the street. You have to go out and counter it. And maybe it's the case that it's not those biker gangs who are out there demonstrating. But yeah, I think this is really a case of the younger right-wing activist groups are out there and they have to be countered because you cannot allow them to grow. But I'd even say a lot of those groups, they're like milquetoast right-wing. They're not
what does that mean?
Fascist.
Milquetoast.
Yeah,
I never heard that before.
They're like conservative plus. They're the
watered down version.
Yeah, I don't even want to say they're the watered down version. There is a fascist movement in this country. It's so small. Most of them are
Hey, tell me more about that, because I think and already I can see people are freaking out. They're like, "Holy shit, what are you guys talking about?" Whatever, right? But I think what's fascinating about your perspective is you don't come at this, from what I can tell, one side is good, the other side is bad, right? Similar to how we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, you're like, look, this shit's messy. And there's a lot of different groups and they're all got their own fucking angles. And frankly, some of the perception of what those groups stand for may not actually be what they stand for if you go and you look at the source materials. And,
right.
and so you all spend your time trying to figure that out, right? Which I appreciate because it's frankly more educated than most people here talk about it. Mm-hmm. But when you say, let's maybe just go kind of group by group. You said there is a fascist movement in the country. What does that look like? How do you guys evaluate how big it is, how serious it is, what the threat is? Just kind of walk me through that.
Mm. Well, when the mainstream talks about fascist, what they're really talking about is those on the right who want to use government in the same way that the left wing wants to use the government. Okay. The same way they want to weaponize government against which is exactly what I think so. There's probably some element of both Democrats and Republicans doing this, but you look at conservatism and they say, no, we don't need to use government power. It's a dangerous weapon. It's a cudgel. We don't want to use it. And then you see Democrats, and I'm not trying to be partisan, this is just my observation, and Democrats get in there and they do weaponize it. They weaponize the IRS against the Tea Party. They weaponize DHS. They weaponize all these groups. Like how many, just as an example, how many murders do you think are attributed to white supremacists per year in the United States? Just ballpark it.
Oh, man. I'd say less than 1,000, maybe less than 200, something like that. Like I'm assuming it's a small number.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. According even to the most liberal sources, like about 30 a year.
Okay.
So the domestic violent extremism is about diminishing 30 murder. Now, of course, there's other forms of
murder's
stuff.
bad,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, but just murders in general, about 30 a year. More people will die due to gang crime in Chicago in 1 month or in 1 year than you get white supremacist murders in 10 years. Mm-hmm. So, again, this is just like misplaced priorities. And I do wonder a lot, why is this so great an emphasis on a movement that's so small?
Okay. Do you have a theory as to what that is?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like yes.
I do see many Democrats publicly eschew violence, but I think they enjoy seeing people in 2016 through 2020. I think they enjoyed seeing Trump supporters get beaten and get death threats and have various forms of protest, getting fired, economic dislocation. Like they really wanted to punish Trump supporters, and it just so happened that you have these left-wing groups do that. And so I think it's a case of violence bad, but don't stop. So
when you point that out, that is what I would call the pro-right critical view of the left, right? Is kind of the way to look at it. If we then turn and flip that the other way, and we say, okay, what is like the pro-left critical of the right view? Is you said already, hey, there is this fascist group, it's small, but it exists. Are there other things that you think have some kind of seriousness or accuracy to them from that angle of critique?
Yeah, I would even say like your average American, fascist has nothing on 1930s. Absolutely nothing. But I do think the move, it's small, but it is growing. And I think they're trying to be proactive.
They being the kind
left,
of fascist,
yeah,
or
like
the left,
the anti-fascists are trying to be proactive. And they say, well, one is one too many, because if you let one go, then there's going to be two, and if there's two, then there's 10, and if there's 10, there's 1,000. And but I would just say, on the other hand, if you look at the common gripes, the actual complaints among these right-wing groups, it is because the country is changing so fast. They're very uncomfortable with the rate at which society is changing. And, you look at Biden even, and, he said, oh, I'm going to bring two groups together. And what did he do? I mean, he turned around and just is very, very divisive. And I look at the things that the government is doing. So I'll give you an example, right? Biden could come out and he could say to conservatives, I understand your complaints about border security. And if Biden replaced Mayorkas, because he's obviously not interested in doing it, if Biden replaced him with someone who could seal up the border as well as it was from 2016 to 2020, that would go a long way in bridging the gap and turning down the temperature on a lot of anti-government extremism or protests or sentiment. But we don't see government doing that. We see government doing the absolute opposite of that, going after Border Patrol agents who are trying to secure the border. And so I look at it as a way, it's like a self-licking ice cream cone. I mean, you just get this thing spinning, and government does things to make more people angry. More people angry, they say, okay, well, we have to organize. And then you have the other side saying, well, look, these people are organizing now. And the process could be stopped, I think. But I don't think either side would be happy with where we're going to go if it doesn't stop.
Are you familiar with the Mike Glover situation? Have you seen this?
Somewhat, yes.
Okay. I'm not, but I saw him post online, and my takeaway, which hopefully you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, was he's an organization very focused on veterans and this stuff. At some point, there was a very small number, I think single-digit number of people who kind of lost their way, right? It sounded like, frankly, they went crazy, and they started taking their view of what the organization should be to the extreme. And again, just like classic radicalization, extremism, like all this stuff. And we've seen that, like, psychologists have studied this for centuries, right? And decades, and understand that, like, you can have a group that is net good and majority of people are good, and there's a radicalization, and like that isn't necessarily the entire group, but still it's a problem, right? And so what I think I understood from what he was saying is like, hey, there was these people, and like once we identified that this was it, we kicked him out. We were super cooperative, and like, well, that's not what we're about. And then it feels like he then said, hey, but our organization has now been identified as one of these extremism groups, and kind of all this stuff. And in that scenario, again, I'm not an expert on it, but it highlighted to me the complexity of this, where you could have a group and a leadership team that says, hey, we want to go do good things and kind of support of all these causes, which I think most Americans are like, hey, we should take care of veterans. We should like do these things. There's a radicalization within the group, which we see on both sides, right? But there's radicalization within the group. The organization tries to do what they perceive to be the right thing. It seems like most people from the outside are like, yeah, that was the right thing, was to kind of separate yourself from the radicalization. But then you also ask yourself, well, like, what should the government do? And like you get into this like weird game where it's like, it's very unclear what is the right answer as to how the various market participants in that scenario should act. Is that one example of many on both sides of the aisle that you see kind of as you guys do your work in terms of like, again, you said you can't label good and bad in, geopolitical conflict. Is it possible to label good and bad in the domestic issues as well?
Well, yeah,
And you're free to tell me that I'm an absolute idiot and got the whole situation wrong with Glover.
No. You can, labeling good and bad is easy. It just depends on your perspective. I just want to say, let's consider the alternative that both are bad in many instances.
which is not a story that you hear in the mainstream media many
Right.
times, right?
Sure,
Good,
right.
good and bad is the divisive thing that can allow you to have people pick sides and argue and all this stuff. But like both are bad, you know. That seems a little bit turning the temperature down a little bit, actually, by saying no, both sides are bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's really tough when both sides the sides that are capable of stopping it are both bad and don't want it to stop.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, for the Glover thing, I don't know exactly, but yeah, I think your understanding is probably accurate. The problem is if you go back to the radical parts of that group who maybe misconstrued, they thought American contingency was something that it was not. It's not a vehicle for violent revolution or anything like that. But I would go back and really try to understand the concerns and what is driving the radicalism among those people. The first step in solving the problem is understanding it. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of journalists are lazy. And they'll say, oh, yeah, my buddy over at whatever, he said, oh, this group was fascist. So, yeah, okay, I'm going to call this group fascist. And you actually go back and you look at some of these groups and they're not really you may not like what they espouse, but they're legitimately not fascist groups. And so, I would try to understand the problem. And in many cases, what the federal government is doing, like, okay, the whole Epstein, Maxwell thing, right? Okay, why do we not know? I mean, why is the government not going after those people? But they will go after a PTA. The FBI will go conduct surveillance on a PTA group because some parents are angry at what their children are learning in school. So if we want to turn down,
sounds crazy, but like that is an actual real example.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's just like there were some anti-abortion activists, like 70-year-old people, and this one woman, she sat down in front of a front door of an abortion clinic, and so that's a federal crime. And now she was arrested, and I think 11 people are actually being charged now by the federal government for obstruction of some law that was passed in the 90s. And I'm not saying she will get this, but she's facing 10 years in federal prison. How is she facing 10 years and someone who burnt down a building in Minneapolis not? How are they going after thousands of hours of tape and man hours and multi-millions of dollars to track down somebody who is standing outside the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, and they're not going after the same people who burnt down buildings and literally murdered people during the summer of 2020. It's the misapplication of justice. It's really selective application of justice that makes people angry.
So, and I think on both sides the belief that the other side is not getting enough attention and the whole thing. But one of the things that you're highlighting here. So let's take January 6th and let's take summer of 2020. Minneapolis, I think, is the one that I personally remember watching and being like, oh, shit just got ratcheted up, right? And my recollection of the events, which somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, there was a protest and seemed relatively peaceful and kind of all this stuff during the day. At least the coverage of it was this is no different than protests that were happening all over the country in many cities. And then at one point, I don't know if I frankly just went and ate dinner or something and came back or what, but all of a sudden it was like, there's a police station on fire. Mm-hmm. And that's when it was like, oh shit, this now is a different level. And who knows who did it, why they did it, like any of this, it was unclear at the moment. It was just like, that isn't the situation. And then I think there was in Tennessee, somebody tried to set like a courtroom on fire and it started to just kind of spread as to like, hey, this got ratcheted up. So we take these two events. The left attacks the right on January 6th and says insurrection and there's the photos and January 6th committee, all that kind of stuff. The right attacks the left and says, yeah, but there is a police station on fire and kind of all this stuff. When we look at these, what you're essentially arguing is like, they're taking different approaches. They have different views of the world, but both sides are actually unhappy in those scenarios. And they believe the system is not working for them. They believe that the government is not serving what their need is, which is not the story that I hear publicly or see in the media. It's, one side's good, one side's bad, the whole thing. But like, actually, if you kind of just everyone take a deep breath for a second and say, hey, both of these sides are saying this is not working for them. What is the release valve? What is the like kind of escape hatch Or is there not one? Is it just literally this keeps getting ratcheted up and you have two sides that are just more and more divisive, and then we get, some sort of bad situation that, is even worse than things that we've seen in the past? Or is there a release valve where, to your point, is it the president, whoever the next president is, or the current one who can kind of provide this escape route? Is there other things that can happen? Like, what is that release valve? Because it doesn't feel like that's obvious today.
Mm-hmm. We are locked in a spiral right now because you have these far left groups. They've been kind of, mostly dormant since probably February 2021 or so. We're probably in a position where if Republicans do end up taking the House and the Senate, I think a lot of those groups will probably reignite. Getting closer to 2024, that becomes, it's a certainty they will. And so really the next 2 years, I think, are going to be very difficult. And the right will look at that and say, oh, look, they're organizing again. The communists are back at it. Like, now we have to organize. And the far left will say, oh, look, the far right's organizing now. Like, we have to really get on the ball. And, it's that self-licking ice cream cone problem. That's what we're locked in. The best we can hope for, I don't think this is going to happen, but the best we can hope for is that in 2024, there is a candidate who wins outright with minimal accusations of voter fraud, maximum trust in the outcome that, yes, this was a free and fair election. The problem is we have not had one of those in some time. And I think this is probably the case where the longer you go without a legitimate, all-around legitimate victor, the more likely it becomes that you still won't. The best case scenario is that, someone gets elected and everyone accepts it. I don't think that's going to happen.
So this is interesting because when you say it hasn't happened in a long time, my mind immediately jumped whether good or bad, right or wrong. Chad, right, in Florida, and like for those that are too young to understand, like literally go watch documentaries or watch the news segments or whatever. Like literally, they were arguing over like, did the paper get punched or not, and like pretty fucking crazy stuff to determine who ultimately became the president of the United States, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
And so like that is very different than the accusations and kind of both sides of the 2016 situation, but like. That still was a contentious multi-day affair that like people kind of forgot about or were too young that maybe paying attention now. Barack Obama doesn't seem like there was as much contention. Maybe you disagree, but that seems like maybe one election where it was like, okay, he wins. Transition, from my recollection, wasn't anything that necessarily sticks out of issue. You get Trump, who I don't think most people said, oh, the election was rigged or anything like that. But it was definitely once I was very happy, once I was not very happy. And so kind of in some way, that's almost like what politics have been for a long time. But it felt like it was ratcheted up for a whole bunch of reasons. 2020 happens. Now it's the accusations of actually rigging and all this stuff. Right now in Brazil, right, which I'm not an expert, I don't think you are either, there's an election, and I've already seen people saying it's real, it's not real. Like, and it almost feels like, okay, now there is a playbook that has been established that when an election occurs, we're going to just see these accusations over and over and over again. That scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Right? Because that feels like, damn, the United States was above this. Right? Like to some degree, like this is what you see in developing nations, in areas where like, a politician, and a warlord. And like maybe the warlord just says, hey, now I'm the president. Yeah. How do you evaluate this? Like, how do you think about it?
Yeah, it's tough. So, if we go back to 2016 and after that election, you have, 25, 30, I don't know the exact number, but somewhere around there, maybe a third, maybe more of the country saying Trump's illegitimate. The Russians got him elected. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then 2020, you say, well, you've got the overnight, hey, it's 3 a.m. and all of a sudden you get this massive dump of votes for Biden in a handful of key states, and it tips him over the top. And now, a third of I don't know the exact numbers, but let's just call it a third of the country says Biden's illegitimate. Well, I look at 2024 and I say, well, we've seen some violence from the right. We've seen capability. We've seen the right organizing. We've seen violence from the left. They've been organizing. Is 2024 going to be the trigger that sets off increased violence? And, that's one of my concerns is, you get into a situation where like you have an Argentina scenario, like kind of a dirty civil war where one side or the other gets elected and they say, oh, the left are doing this or the right are doing this. Like we have to go after them. They're terrorists. They're domestic insurgents. They're all the things that, that conservatives have been called, Trump supporters have been called. And, and there is some legitimate organized political violence, not just opportunistic violence, but like team deathmatch, like, hey, we're a group, we're going to go out and conduct political violence, which is really one of the worst case scenarios.
You're saying that that is a possibility, or that's happened in the United States? I
think that is a possibility. So far, I think it's mainly been kind of ad hoc opportunistic violence, like mob violence, for instance.
Is it bad? I almost call that stupidity. Right. Like there's people who mob mentality happens. They're out, they're doing stuff, whatever. And like opportunistically a situation shows itself and somebody is either too emotional, too stupid, too whatever. And like something occurs and all hell breaks loose. Right. But what you're talking about is, I don't know, much more organized than that and much more intentional. Like we are going to go affect change in a way with violence.
Yep. Effects based. Yep. I think that's the worst case scenario that can, if the 2024 election, the contested election accusations is a trigger for that type of violence. And yeah, we've seen like Proud Boys and Antifa get into it. And I would not call that organized political violence. This would be more of like, a group of people going out and saying, hey, this is it. We're going to kick off the Civil War. And this is something that if it were to get going, just very, decentralized, distributed groups saying, okay, well, they're doing it over there. I guess it's our turn over here now. That
scares the shit out of me.
It's bad. I mean, it could be very, very bad. It could be very, very bad. It could be so bad that the government may not, in fact, be able to stop it. And the situation you would run into is the government actually making matters worse. I'm not sure that that's something that you can just let die out, but it's also very tricky. I mean, you saw in Iraq and Afghanistan too. I mean, one slight misstep, you're going to make some other people angry, and you're going to trigger another round over here.
Sons of Iraq. I mean,
exactly.
Right. I've told a story before to people. I don't know if I ever talked about it on the podcast. And again, my memory over a decade ago, so will fuck things up, so no one hold it against me. But basically, the United States was engaged in combat in Iraq. We pretty handily took the country from the invasion perspective, and then we went into nation building mode, and we had a hard time. And it was pretty obvious fairly early, we're not built to do this. And the United States was susceptible to kind of the insurgent attacks. And one of the turning points, or at least in kind of a momentum shift, was going to young military men in Iraq and saying, this is your fucking country. Right. And like, you need to have national pride and you need to stand up because we can't do it. Right. And in some way, it's crazy to hear United States military saying, hey, we can't do this, right? But they essentially armed, trained, and then helped to staff what essentially checkpoints, right? I mean, I remember we'd go do night route clearance and we'd drive by and, we'd give them shit because they're sleeping and stuff, right? But they were out there and they had their weapons and they knew it better than we did, right? Talk about Intel, like these, you've been here for 18, 20, 25, 30 years. Like you understand who's a good guy, who's a bad guy, who should be in your town, who should not be in your town. And it changed the battlefield. Now people argue how effective was it? How long did it last? Whatever. But like that was a form of what we're talking about, where there was ultimately, yes, it was a US led effort, but there was a group of nationals in Iraq who were military age who basically got together and said, we got to put an end to some of this shit. I don't think the United States, it's very unclear to me that would be a good situation, nor it would be allowed. Like, I mean, just like there's so much different. We are not in an active combat zone, right? Yeah, like we live in a country that I like to think is safe and people can speak their mind and do all these things. You're talking about a world that is very different than the world maybe that I want to live in, and it appears that we live in at the moment without a trigger to head somewhere else.
Yeah, the kind of the ironic thing is, Sons of Iraq was Petraeus's answer to, and other people, their answer to Al Qaeda in Iraq. You had a whole political party forming in Anbar province, before it became Sons of Iraq proper. But that didn't stop the killing. they went out and, grabbed a bunch of Al-Qaeda in Iraq guys and shot him dead in the street and called us, hey, by the way, you come pick this guy up. Like he's gone now. But yeah, I mean, it didn't.
That guy on your playing cards.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right. For those that don't know, the United States literally had 52 deck playing cards with faces of Iraqis on it, which, tells you exactly what the mission was.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, that was a roughly organic movement, at least at the very beginning, the Sahawal al-Iraq movement. And, but yeah, the thing was, okay, you have a bunch of these Sunni fighters and, middle-aged or military age males. Yeah, let's form up into a militia so they can protect their, so let's form a bunch of these middle-aged or military age males up and put them into a militia and they can go protect their country. Well, it didn't stop ethnic violence. I mean, it didn't.
Did it inflame it? Did it make it worse? Or was it just kind of the baseline is the baseline and the players are different? Yeah,
in some areas, because these were Sunnis and Maliki, Shia, was president. And at the same time, Maliki was trying to sideline Sunnis in the Iraq army. And so, and we see the same thing in Afghanistan. Oh, you go help this tribe. Well, guess what? This tribe's been an enemy of this other tribe for 1,000 years. And now this other tribe thinks you're against them. And so they're going to start attacking you now. I don't know that there is a way to win, but you bring up a good point. Sons of Iraq was meant to stabilize Iraq. And it did. It mostly did, especially in Anbar province. But what one of the things you really did was enable militias to go after Shias, in some instances.
Mm-hmm. This idea of a release valve. You mentioned 2024, whichever side wins, they win emphatically, right? It is clear to everyone, hey, that is the winner, and there's acceptance of that winner. When that occurs, and I'm saying when because I'm hoping that happens, what is kind of the second and third order effects? Is it possible to wind back the clock, kind of go back to pre all of the pressure that's built up and all of the just, I'm going to call it nonsense because frankly, I think there's a lot of people in the country who are just like, look, I don't want to live in a world like this. But is it possible to return, or is there now kind of this idea of like you advance so far and like that's the new battleground, or that's kind of the new boundary?
Mm-hmm. I think the real problem is social cohesion.
Okay, explain that.
Well, social cohesion. I mean, people getting along. They have shared values, shared language, shared culture, shared outlook, and unfortunately, you go back and you read Sir John Glubb's Fate of Empires, and he talks about empires follow a specific cycle, and he says last about 250 years. Roughly 10 generations. And it starts with the outbreak of an empire. You have a new leader or a new idea, and it catches on, like you win a big victory over someone, you take their land, and okay, now you start your empire. And you get into the age of pioneers, and they're settling and expanding the empire. And then you have the age of commerce. Well, guess what? More commercial interests you have, the more military you need to protect it. And so you start military expansion. And then later on in the cycle, you get to the age of intellect. And the people who are living then are so far removed from the initial spark that's actually birthed that empire. They're so far removed, they don't get it. They don't share those values anymore. They don't share the same outlook. And, Glubb talks about all the factors at play. And, he said the Assyrian Empire lasted for about 247 years, roughly. British Empire, 250 years. Pax Romana lasted 270 years. So we're all, according to him, we're about in a 250-year ballpark. And one of the things that happens at the end of empire is you lose social cohesion, which is exactly what's happening in the United States. And at first I said, well, this is a single source information. Let me go look. And there are other researchers, someone completely, and I don't remember his name, and I probably couldn't even pronounce it if I could remember it, but he calculated up his own like 30 some odd empires, and he found this like 260, 270 years, which is very darn close to Glubb's 250 years. So I actually think there's quite a bit of the math is right, at least.
Yeah. What's interesting is there's a number of generations there, right? And one of the things that in the investment world or in the finance world, there's some paraphrase of it, but basically, the first generation makes the money. Second generation does a pretty good job of holding on to it. By the third generation, it's gone, right?
Yeah,
and this is obviously expanded in the 250 year range, but like sure damn sounds pretty similar, right? Of kind of there's people who create a empire or a country. There's people who kind of take care of it, and then there's people who fuck it up essentially.
Right.
And I think we hope that doesn't happen. But let's play this out, right? And say, okay, that's where we're headed. What do you do? Do you just, hey, where's the next empire going to be built? And let me go, where it's prosperous and safe and kind of on the rise. And it's the equivalent of somebody who's worked at a big tech company for, 10 years saying, fuck it, I'm going to a startup that's the next great tech company. Mm-hmm. Or do you stay and try to change it? Like what happens?
Yeah. So Peter Turchin was a professor, and he studied the rise and fall of states. And one of the things he says is, if I recall correctly, two things end up happening is a civilization or an empire is either conquered by a neighboring empire or it falls from within and it's brought down internally. And it is at some point replaced by something else. So, you look at the British Empire. I mean, the United Kingdom, Britain still exists as a country. It's just no longer an empire. And maybe this is what happens to the United States is I think there are probably several things that could happen. But, maybe it's just the United States doesn't go away. It doesn't cease to exist. Like we just don't have a carrier strike group station in Japan anymore. Mm-hmm. And the dollar is no longer the world reserve currency. And, in terms of what can you do, you have to get to a state that I think is fiscally responsible, mm-hmm. and a state with a leadership that is going to look out for its residents, a state that has good industry. You produce something, you make something, you export something of value. And I think that's probably the best place you can be in, because the political establishment you have at the governor and the state legislature may well be the one that you keep that becomes your new government. I'm just saying, following into logical conclusions here, you got to get to a good state now.
Yeah.
If you think that's going to happen.
How do you learn so much about this stuff? Like what you guys do at the business, you essentially look around the world and you try to come up with intel quality, or what I call like military quality intel. And my
oh yeah, I don't know the military.
I said that I knew I was going to get them.
That's a very low bar. Yeah, that's a very low bar.
All right, explain my joke that many people may have missed there. Military grade intel.
Yeah.
Explain.
Well, it's just like I had a meeting with someone the other day, and I was explaining what they do, and they said, "Oh, you're military grade." I said, "Look, anything military grade is made by the lowest bidder. It is not the quality you think it is." So yeah, military grade. And plus there's the joke, about whatever the joke is about there's many of them.
Yeah, the military folks will get that one. Yeah. But you guys, obviously you take a lot of the stuff that you learned in the military and implemented there, contractor work. Now you're doing it in the private sector. But the folks who are consuming this are everyone from who's just interested in events around the world, trying to learn and educate themselves, to professionals who are making decisions, whether they're corporations, investment firms, whatever. How do you kind of like go through the event? So maybe a great way to think about this is like you wake up in the morning. What do you check? Are you checking the news? Are you checking internal proprietary dashboards? Are you just jumping on Twitter like the rest of us, where you're taking a shit and you're like, what are people tweeting about? what is the kind of the first couple of things that you do in the morning from a professional kind of intel standpoint?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we spend a lot of money on access to information, various databases, and so I wake up. I'm sitting at my computer 5:30 most mornings, really checking what happened overnight, making sure China hasn't nuked Taiwan or whatever. Just looking at what happened overnight, checking kind of the first thing domestically off the presses, what's domestic media reporting, and I have my feed set up in keywords and topics that I'm looking at, and so from the get go, we catch up on what happened overnight. And then we kind of add it to our expectations, and a lot like financial people do. Mm-hmm. You wake up and you check Asian markets.
Mm-hmm. Twitter, how important is it for the intel world?
Well, the intel world is, I mean, it's very important. They're citizen journalists. They're apparent, basically, I mean, they can, if something's happening in Japan or in Egypt, a lot of the times, yeah, you might learn about it first on Twitter, and you've even seen, print media and other people cite Twitter sources like, oh, we saw this on Twitter. And
my favorite is when it's like a pseudonymous account and they're like, fuck it, they don't know who it is. So they just say like, the cat, right?
Yeah,
or
right.
whatever.
Yeah. So yeah, Twitter makes, Twitter is, in a lot of cases, is the first place where you'll find news. And I would say even more importantly than that, Twitter's where you'll find alternative sources of information. And even if it's, it's not the journalistic narrative or the state-backed narrative that you're reading in some newspaper somewhere, it's someone that said, oh yeah, I was there. This is actually what happened, or this is my perspective, or here's the non-state sanctioned version of what happened.
We've talked a lot about geopolitics, about domestic issues, kind of, social, all these different things. It's not all you all do, right? So there's things like fuel shortages and other components. Talk a little bit about that part of the work and like, why is that important, and kind of what are the decisions people are making once they actually are able to kind of get their hands on this type of reporting?
So, we exist to produce early warning. A lot of times the information's there and just only a few people have put it together. A hedge fund has put it together and they're acting on it. They're not telling anybody because they want the advantage. So we try to act as like kind of a hedge fund with the quality of information that we can source. And then, we draw logical conclusions. And really our goal is to do that before it hits the news, right? I mean, you can read it in our report. I mean, and it happens very frequently. You read it in our report that goes out every morning at 8 a.m. Central Time, and you hear about it on the news a day or two from now. And so our whole goal is to say, hey, this is happening, or this is going to happen, or there's a good chance this will happen over the next X number of days. And then, yeah, people can act on it, and they can make decisions based off of that. I mean, really, that's what any good intelligence does.
I'm fascinated by the privatization of various things in the defense industry. I think probably the most famous initial one was Blackwater and kind of the contractors and all of that. You now have examples on the technology side and kind of aspiration to be the next great prime, and a company like Anduril and a lot of the great work that they're doing there. Is it possible to privatize the intel work? And is there a world where the private sources end up maybe not being in competition with the military sources, but private sources are relied on by military leaders? Absolutely.
Look at Maxar Technologies and what they're doing right now in Ukraine. It's a private company.
Explain a little bit more about that business.
Yeah, I mean, Maxar, they take satellite imagery. So they're an imagery intelligence firm. And, they're providing that to the Ukrainian government. And you have the Ukrainian MOD making decisions based off of those satellites. So, yes, we are probably getting, just like Blackwater and the other places where military action's been outsourced, that probably is the future of intelligence. There's a lot of in the military and the government. There's a lot of institutional inertia and bureaucracy, and some of those things some of those state sanctioned things will probably have to continue to be carried out by military or civilian groups. But the use of contractors has proliferated, even for intelligence gathering, and that probably is the future.
Contractors for intelligence gathering, net positive, net negative. What's kind of your evaluation of it so far?
I would say net positive. I look at, I spent my last tour to Afghanistan was 18 months. I was doing roughly a similar job that I would have done as a sergeant, as an E5, but I was getting paid a lot more to do it. Mm-hmm. I also didn't have, there's no morning formation. I don't have, a section sergeant or NCO, double checking up on me. And so, I think there's less red tape as a contractor. That's why I really enjoyed being a contractor. It's like, wake up, go do your job, and just do it to the best of your ability. Now, not everyone did that, but I think a lot of it's tough to say. They threw so much money at getting contractors, and I think a lot of that money was wasted. I would say net positive, because you get people who have experience, who want to be over there doing the job, just not in the military anymore, because there's just so much BS in the military.
If I remember the numbers correctly, if you were combat engineer, infantryman, et cetera, in 2008, 2009 in Iraq, with hazard pay and kind of all the different, ancillary payments, I think you probably made, I don't know, probably somewhere 70, 80K, something like that, 65, 70, whatever the number was. It was below the $87,000 threshold that basically you weren't taxed. And I remember on the way out of Iraq, we went to Kuwait for 2 weeks or 10 days, whatever it was. And essentially had like a job fair, right? Set up there, and it was all the contracting companies. And it was like, listen, if you turn your ass right back, you go home, but like basically go right back to the country, do exactly what you were just doing. Sometimes even a less dangerous job. We'll pay you $90,000 for a 6-month contract. If you don't go home in those 6 months, we'll pay you $10K. So it's $100K total. You stay for a year and don't go home, it's $200K.
Right.
And there's a lot of guys who's like, well, fuck, I was just willing to do it for way less money, right? And a lot more bureaucracy. And usually I was actually put in more danger.
Right.
Why would I not go back? And it always, it's just like, look, what is the value, right? If you think from a business mindset, like what is the value of the person in that country doing something? Private sector had a lot more value assigned to it than the kind of defense industry or the military. And so it's fascinating how you can use money and what they're willing to pay as a proxy for a lot of other things.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think a lot of that's probably waste, fraud, and abuse, Of
course.
But, going to big defense contractors. And, if
you're getting paid $200K, what are they getting paid?
Yeah, they're making way more. So I'm just saying, I'm speaking from my position and my role, what I was doing as a contractor in Afghanistan. However, it's a different time. You and I both learned a lot since we enlisted, and when I enlisted, I was super gung ho, and I get over there and I start realizing like this is not what the average flag waving American thinks it is, which is very unfortunate. But to your point, contracting, you get a lot higher tier. You're not just taking volunteers off the street. It's like if you come to work for our company, a company like Blackwater, some of the other kind of top tier firms, like you're going to be worth your salt. We're not just going to hire anybody just because they show up and fill out an application.
War's fucking nasty business, man. Right?
It's a moneymaker. Yeah.
It's a business, but it's also just a nasty situation where I think one of the things that has really bothered me, frankly, is there's been a lot of critiques of the Navy SEAL training. Right. And I've actually never said the story before, but on the way to Iraq, we went to Fort Polk in Louisiana, about the absolute shittiest place in the world because it was the middle of the summer and the fucking insects and mosquitoes. It was horrible. Right? I hated it. And I remember we were doing these training exercises in preparation. And on one of them, basically they were like, all right, y'all gonna go up here and you're gonna pull security. Okay, whatever. You go up there, pull security. I was around like a fake village that they had built or whatever. And next thing I know, I see some dudes who just look cool come out of the woods, right? And they're fucking doing their thing, whatever. And they're pretty quick. And then everyone's like, all right, let's get out of here. And we go back to where we're staying. And, it's a bunch of guys who are just like, what the fuck was that, right? So they start asking around, whatever. And it was Navy SEALs who supposedly they did an exercise where they dropped off in the ocean, they swim, they got to fucking, navigate their way or whatever. And that was kind of the conclusion of it. And so, whatever, fine. We're there, and these dudes are staying in a barracks that is, within eyesight. I'm fucking exhausted. So is every other guy I'm with. They're talking about what are they going to go eat, whatever. And we see these SEALs, and they're now working out. And these dudes are pulling tires and just the whole thing, like literally out of a movie, right?
Right.
And I remember sitting there staring at them, just being like, I'm so glad those motherfuckers are on our side. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Like, and that was the only experience I had seeing the training and like all the stuff and everything. But there's not very many people who would have done that because my understanding of what they had just done was grueling already. And then they still, hey, I got to get my workout in. And it feels like there's a disconnect between the public conversation and then when you see the reality. And it's like, by the way, some of those guys, just do the math. Like they didn't come home, right? They even though all the preparation still wasn't enough. And so I think that to your point about social cohesion, there's also like an education information standpoint. The more people can understand about some of this stuff, they realize it's not necessarily good and bad. There's not necessarily, you know, clean cut. Hey, I want this streamed on national television or written in the New York Times, because it's nasty. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very unfortunate that I think there is, and I'm going to tread lightly here because I'm not one of those dudes, you know, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, I think there is like when that SEAL murdered one of the Green Berets, and I forget where it was. You know, there's a lot of, I think there are things that happen that, you know, people call it toxic, and you know, just from reading the news, you can get that. But those, you know, those guys, I think most of them are like top tier quality, the best dudes you could possibly want on your team. And it's very, and again, I don't have a dog in this fight, but unfortunately, when you see the politicization of training, like non-soft dudes making decisions for how those guys are going to go through their own pipeline and go through their own selection process, like don't mess with that. Let them run that shit, because they've got to deploy with those people, right? They have to choose who they want, you know, to join their brotherhood. And so I think that's a travesty. What's happening right now is civilians, people who really are probably have no business making those types of decisions, saying, well, we're going to cut this phase and we're going to allow this to happen over here. And
it's what are you optimizing for, right? Like you know, look, I meet a lot of founders, a lot of people who want to work at various companies. I even talk to, you know, their investors, whatever. I always like to ask, what are you optimizing for? And some people, what they're optimizing for today may not be what it is tomorrow or whatever. I think most of those processes, they're not perfect. They'd be the first to say that. Most of the training processes, most of the selection processes, et cetera, is they are optimizing for the best absolute war fighters we can put on the battlefield so we can be successful, right? And that's how they were designed, and that's how they've been run. And again, they fuck up, they make mistakes, whatever, they go too far, all that stuff is true. But that is what they're optimizing for. It does seem, to your point, there's a lot of people now who, you know, they have interest, whether it's intellectual interest or some other interest that they're trying to figure out how they can, you know, kind of meddle in this. That's not what they're optimizing for. They're optimizing for other things. And again, maybe they're right, maybe they're not, whatever, but that is a shift in the target, right? That's a shift in what we're optimizing for. And like, we should be aware of that. We should understand that the goal is now shifting, and we should have a conversation around, is that a better goal to go after? Or actually, are we losing kind of sight of what these people are going to have to go do? And I don't have the answers, right? And I don't think you claim to have the answers either, but you can see it happen, and it's kind of crazy to watch in real time.
Yeah, I'm afraid this is maybe one of those, you know, end of empire indicators where, you know, we're no longer optimizing for lethality. You know, like the Mattis school of, should we do this with the military? Does it help us kill more people faster? If it does, yeah, let's look at it. If it doesn't, then no, let's not do that. And yeah, just you know, the things you've seen
canceled.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. The military killing people, like that is not good.
Right. Well, you know, the Marines have that new ad campaign out now, right? And it's not the pink-haired, you know, person joining the Marine Corps. It's like Marines going out and conducting operations and killing people, you know. And I mean, not literally in the ad, but that's a very important shift from what we saw just a few years ago, where, you know, it's like a softer, gentler Marine Corps.
The pendulum swings, I think, in both directions, as we've seen, right? And it does feel that it has swung. But I also think there's recruiting issues that they're having. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into it. I'll leave you with this, because I think you'll appreciate it. A friend of mine was saying, you know, what do you think about all the Russia-Ukraine stuff or whatever? And I just said to myself, I said, I wonder, let me go Google this. And I went and I Googled something. I came back to him, I said, hey man, there's a lot of people advocate for World War III. Military's paying $50,000 signing bonus for somebody to sign up if they're so interested in it.
Right. Yeah.
They pay you to sign up, right? I don't see a line out the door. They're paying $50K because they can't get a lot of people to sign up. And so I think that, you know, again, I just like looking at the market. And if they're having to pay these huge signing bonuses, it means that they can't get enough people to sign up. They can't get enough people to sign up. But there's a hell of a lot of people on Twitter talking about, you know, I think in the last 4 or 5 years, I'm pretty sure that World War III has trended on Twitter at least 3 times. There was the Iran situation, the North Korea situation, and then the Ukraine situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a crazy world, right? And again, maybe that's just what's always happened and now it's just on social media or whatever, but they're paying that much and there's a lot of people talking about it. It just seems like there's a disconnect.
Yeah. There's a very big disconnect, and I'm afraid that politicians are going to want to fight the next war, which may be a world war, and they're like empire-ending implications if we lose.
Let's hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Where can we send people to find you on the internet or sign up for all the great work you guys do?
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a great discussion. Our website, you can find us at forwardobserver.com. And we do a daily YouTube live stream for about 15 minutes every morning, talk about global issues. That's just the Forward Observer channel over on YouTube. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram and a bunch of other places under Gray Zone Warlord. It's Gray with an A.
Gray Zone Warlord. What a great name. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We definitely will do this again.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.